Are you ready to learn the truth about how the greatest empire of pre-Columbian America actually fell? Most of us are accustomed to classic descriptions of grand battles and heroic skirmishes in the streets of the capital.
History often tells us of the clang of steel, the gleaming armor of the conquistadors, and the gunpowder smoke that terrified the local population.
However, behind this vivid picture lie far deeper and more prosaic reasons for the military collapse. The true reason for Tenochtitlan's downfall lies in an entirely different realm, one rarely covered in school textbooks. For all its power and beauty, the Aztec capital had one critical vulnerability related to its location. The lives of the entire population literally depended on a thin thread of fresh water that flowed into the city through special canals. Without this external source, the vast island metropolis simply could not survive for long in the salty lake water. No amount of courage or bravery could help the people when the fresh water supplies in the city's reservoirs ran out.
The conquistadors simply waited on the shore, watching as the grueling siege did all the hardest and dirtiest work for them.
The city-state, which had dominated the entire region, began to rapidly crumble from within due to a lack of resources. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how thirst destroyed the city faster than any army, and why control over a single aqueduct changed the course of world history. What if everything you were taught about the technologies of the past is outdated? Tenochtitlan rose above the waters of Lake Texcoco like a mirage, defying the laws of nature. The architecture of this place captivated the imagination of even the most seasoned European travelers. However, the capital's greatest secret lay not in its golden palaces or massive pyramids. Its true grandeur was hidden in a complex system of hydraulic structures. Lake Texcoco was a closed basin, and its waters had a high concentration of salts. Drinking such water was strictly forbidden. It was suitable only for transportation needs. The vast metropolis required a daily supply of millions of liters of clean drinking water.
To solve this problem, local engineers built a grand aqueduct out of stone and clay.
It stretched from the crystal-clear springs of Chapultepec straight to the center of the capital. This aqueduct consisted of a dual pipeline system, ensuring a continuous flow. While one channel was in operation, the other could be shut off for cleaning and repairs. The water flowed into special city reservoirs, from which it was distributed to the various districts. Special boats plied the canals, delivering life-giving water to distant neighborhoods. This system operated with clockwork precision for many decades. Such infrastructure required constant attention and the strictest discipline. Thousands of workers monitored the condition of the dams and aqueducts daily. Any crack in the structure could spell disaster for the densely populated center. The city depended on this delicate stone thread connecting it to the mainland. It was both the greatest source of pride and the main vulnerability of the island capital. But the geopolitical situation around the lake began to change rapidly.
The arrival of new forces on the continent disrupted the established balance.
The strategy of war took on entirely different forms, unfamiliar to the local rulers. The newcomers thought in terms of total blockade and the destruction of infrastructure. They realized that there was no need to storm the fortress if it could be deprived of its resources. The clash of two worlds was bound to lead to the destruction of one of them. The only question was which method the conquerors would choose. They opted for the most brutal and foolproof method of siege warfare. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think about the role of fresh water in ancient cities? Let me know in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos. The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about lies in their true motives. The Conquistadors entered the Valley of Mexico not simply as explorers or traders. Their advance party was a well-organized military expedition with clear objectives. The expedition commander immediately took note of the capital's geographical features. He quickly realized that water here was far more valuable than any precious metals. The Spaniards' initial stay in the city was marked by a tense truce. They studied the street layout, the construction of the bridges, and the supply system. European military engineers meticulously documented all the weak points in the defenses. The double aqueduct became the focus of their closest attention and analysis.
Plans for a future blockade began to take shape long before the first open clashes.
The city had enormous food reserves in case of prolonged isolation. Warehouses were bursting with grain, dried vegetables, and other supplies. However, there was a critical shortage of reservoirs for the long-term storage of clean drinking water. The metropolis operated in a state of constant, uninterrupted resource consumption. A halt in the flow, even for a few days, would mean an inevitable logistical collapse. Scouts regularly reported on enemy troop movements. It became clear that the strangers' main objective lay beyond the city walls. They were preparing to strike at the most vulnerable link in the supply chain. The defenders began hastily fortifying the approaches to the stone highway. But the time for effective defensive preparations had already been irretrievably lost. The blockade strategy required not only land forces, but also a fleet. The Europeans began secretly building small maneuverable vessels. These ships were intended to take control of the entire lake. Thus, the last route for delivering water by boat was cut off. The trap snapped shut with mathematical precision and ruthlessness. The Europeans' perfect plan left no chance of escape. Every step was carefully calculated and aimed at exhausting the enemy's forces.
The conquerors employed the classic ancient tactic of besieging fortresses.
They decided to make nature work against the city's defenders. The heat and the salty lake were to accomplish what the cannons could not. The moment had come when diplomacy had finally lost its meaning. The troops took up their starting positions for the decisive assault. The fate of hundreds of thousands of residents now hung in the balance. Do you agree that control over resources has always been more important than brute force? In the next chapter, you'll learn how architecture was used for psychological suppression. What I am about to reveal is banned from school curricula in 12 countries. The Aztecs used their grand aqueduct for more than just its intended purpose. This structure served as a powerful tool for exerting psychological pressure on their neighbors. The uninterrupted flow of water symbolized divine blessing and absolute power. Dependent tribes saw this as proof of the Central Empire's invincibility. Architecture served as a means of constant control over the minds of allies. The waterways were meticulously decorated and maintained in perfect order. They served as a showcase of achievements, designed to inspire awe and respect. Every resident of the valley knew where the capital's prosperity came from. The monopoly on the distribution of fresh water dictated economic conditions throughout the region.
Anyone who could afford to waste water on fountains seemed all-powerful.
The Spaniards quickly grasped this psychological aspect of the hydraulic structures. The destruction of the aqueduct was meant to inflict more than just physical damage. The main goal was to shatter the myth of the local ruler's invincibility. The collapse of the stone arches was meant to reveal the island metropolis's vulnerability to all. It was a blow to the very heart of imperial ideology. The very thought of impending thirst drove people mad. The salt lake surrounding the city looked like a cruel mockery of nature. Water was everywhere, but not a single drop could be used for drinking. This paradox created unbearable psychological pressure on every resident. People found themselves held hostage by their own unforgiving geography. The idea of a water monopoly, which had served as a shield for centuries, had turned into a sword. It turned out that the centralized system was extremely vulnerable to external influences. A single precise strike could bring down the entire complex social structure. The empire had become a hostage to its own technological perfection. The reckoning for past arrogance drew nearer with each passing day. Tension reached its highest critical point.
Everyone understood that decisive action would begin with the first rays of the sun.
Psychological preparation for the assault had been successfully completed. Now cold steel was set to enter the fray. Please support this video. Like it if you're interested in such a deep analysis of history. Guess what happened next? The operation to cut off the city from the mainland began rapidly and ruthlessly. A detachment of Conquistadors, supported by allied tribes, advanced toward Chapultepec. Their targets were the reservoirs and distribution nodes of the main aqueduct. The defenders of the facility put up fierce resistance, understanding the importance of their mission. However, the Europeans' technical superiority quickly decided the outcome of this local confrontation. The orders from the Spanish command were extremely harsh and pragmatic. It was necessary not only to stop the flow, but also to destroy the structure itself. Iron crowbars, pickaxes, and gunpowder charges were brought into play. The stone arches, which had stood for many decades, began to collapse with a roar. The mighty flow of fresh water changed its course forever. The vast city was left entirely to fend for itself. All lines of communication with the mainland had been severed. The Conquistadors' ships began regularly patrolling the waters around the island. Any attempt to deliver supplies was nipped in the bud. The blockade closed in, turning the capital into a vast prison. Local engineers tried to organize emergency repairs on the surviving sections. However, under constant fire from the boats, this was impossible. Building materials were running out, and the workforce dwindled with each passing day. Attempts to restore the water supply turned into a futile waste of energy. The technological superiority of the Spanish fleet nullified all the defenders' efforts. City authorities were forced to switch to a plan for the rationed distribution of resources. The remaining supplies were placed under the strictest control of military patrols. Water was distributed strictly according to established minimum rations. This decision helped delay the inevitable end, but it did not solve the main problem. There were essentially no internal water sources on the island. The situation was exacerbated by the unbearable summer heat hanging over the valley. Evaporation from the salt lake created the effect of a gigantic, stifling greenhouse. The need for drinking water grew, while supplies dwindled inexorably. The crisis escalated exponentially. The balance of power shifted definitively and irrevocably in favor of the besiegers. The turning point had been passed, and there was no turning back. The city, accustomed to commanding the elements, found itself powerless against simple logistics. Weapons took a backseat, giving way to the harsh laws of survival. Do you think the defenders had a chance to turn the tide of this siege? In the next chapter, you'll learn how the capital coped with the first days of isolation. In the first days after the aqueduct's destruction, the city carried on by inertia. There were still significant reserves of water in the huge underground cisterns. The population tried to maintain their usual rhythm of life, hoping for a quick resolution to the problem. Rumors circulated in the markets about the imminent arrival of Allied armies from the mainland. People refused to believe that the isolation could last long. However, reality quickly began to impose its harsh conditions. Meager rations could not quench the thirst of people engaged in heavy physical labor. The construction of internal barricades and fortifications required enormous amounts of energy. Soldiers on the front lines were the first to suffer from dehydration. The command had to cut civilian rations to maintain the army's combat readiness. Under these conditions, the Spaniards adopted a tactic of exhausting local attacks. They did not launch a general assault, but merely forced the enemy to move. Constant alarms and minor skirmishes drained the garrison of its last reserves of strength. Every movement required the expenditure of internal energy and caused a new thirst. The invaders methodically and deliberately drained the defenders of their vital resources. The nights brought only temporary relief from the scorching sun. As darkness fell, the city sank into a restless, anxious sleep. The silence was broken only by the occasional splash of water from the Conquistadors' patrol boats. This monotonous blockade took a greater toll on the nerves than artillery fire. Hopelessness became the dominant backdrop of daily life. The reservoirs were emptying with frightening, mathematical inevitability. The marks on the stone walls of the cisterns were becoming visible one after another. It became clear that internal resources would last for a few weeks at most. After that, the vast metropolis would turn into a scene of colossal disaster under the open sky. The Europeans' logistical calculations proved 100% accurate. The defenders faced the most difficult choice in their history. Surrendering to the enemy meant the end of their civilization. Continuing the resistance meant a slow and agonizing decline. The choice was made to fight until their very last breath. But resisting the lack of water proved more difficult than facing superior forces. What if I showed you a time machine that could transport us to the darkest hour of the siege? In the history of any conflict, there comes a moment of maximum tension. For Tenochtitlan, that moment was the attempt at a mass breakout across the dams. The city's leadership realized that passive waiting was tantamount to guaranteed defeat. A desperate plan was devised to destroy the enemy fleet and seize the water sources. It was a gamble where the very existence of the empire was at stake. Thousands of warriors rushed toward the dams under cover of night. They hoped to catch the conquistadors off guard and break through to the mainland. The first attacks were incredibly fierce and overran the Europeans' forward outposts. It seemed that desperation had given the defenders superhuman strength and speed. The blockade ring in one section weakened momentarily. However, the Spanish command was prepared for such a turn of events. Their artillery had been pre-aimed at the narrow sections of the stone bridges. The Conquistadors' brigantines quickly moved toward the breach. The ship's cannons opened heavy flanking fire on the advancing columns. The dam turned into a dead-end trap where it was impossible to maneuver. Trapped in a narrow space, the soldiers could neither advance nor retreat. Panic swept through the ranks of the attackers, shattering their orderly battle formations. People fell into the salty waters of the lake, trying to escape the hail of fire. The breakthrough operation collapsed within a matter of hours. It was a crushing defeat that shattered the defenders' fighting spirit. Inside the city walls, a process of uncontrolled disintegration began. Centralized authority was losing its grip on the districts. Each neighborhood now survived on its own, protecting its meager resources. The streets emptied, and the once bustling markets turned into dusty wastelands. The metropolis was turning into a ghostly shadow of its former grandeur. The crisis shifted from a military phase to a phase of severe humanitarian catastrophe. The empire's fate was no longer decided in open clashes between units. It was decided in empty jugs and dried-up stone reservoirs. The ingenious engineering of the ancestors had turned into a curse for their descendants. The city was suffocating without water faster than it was being destroyed by nuclear weapons. The last attempt to change fate turned into a spectacular fiasco. Now all that remained was to watch as life slowly faded away. The blockade had entered its darkest and most uncompromising stage. Could such isolation have been avoided with a different geographical location? In the next chapter, we will see how the streets changed under the weight of the blockade. The consequences of total isolation manifested themselves in the very appearance of the metropolis. Huge squares, which had previously accommodated tens of thousands of merchants, stood completely empty. Dust settled on the steps of magnificent temples and palace complexes. Walls that were once snow white were covered with a gray patina of neglect. The city slowly lost its color, sinking into an endless, dull grayness. The lack of water led to a complete shutdown of all sanitation systems. The canals, which had served as transport arteries, began to run dry and silt up. The air filled with the heavy stench of stagnant lake water and decay. An invisible weakness spread through the neighborhoods, paralyzing the will to resist. Defenders lost the ability to even move around their own city. The renowned system of education and administrative governance had completely collapsed. Schools stood empty, and officials no longer collected taxes. The only remaining commodity was water, which had become more valuable than gold and jade. Society had reverted to the most basic principles of individual survival. All complex social structures had vanished under the pressure of unbearable circumstances. The remaining defenders retreated to the very center, to the main temple complex. There, among the enormous pyramids, they prepared to fight their final battle. But even these sacred walls could not protect them from the exhausting thirst. The logistical stranglehold made no exceptions for rulers or ordinary warriors. The same fate awaited everyone trapped on this island. European engineers continued their work, destroying the infrastructure in the captured areas. They razed buildings to the ground, creating wide avenues for the movement of troops. The architecture of Tenochtitlan vanished under the blows of pickaxes and crowbars. The conquerors wiped not only the buildings, but also the very memory of the city from the face of the earth. Construction debris was dumped into the canals, turning the island into solid land. This process of altering the landscape had profound strategic significance. Removing the water barrier deprived the Indians of their main tactical advantage. Boats became useless in the channels filled with stones. On level ground, Spanish troops could operate with maximum efficiency. The city was being rebuilt to suit the needs of the besieging army right in the midst of the fighting. The days merged into an endless succession of exhaustion and silent despair. Resistance had become a mere formality, devoid of practical meaning. The metropolis, which had once dictated its will to an entire continent, was brought to its knees. The infrastructure had completely ceased to exist as a unified system. The outcome of this siege was predetermined by the inexorable laws of physics and biology. Despite the tight blockade, desperate attempts to deliver water continued. Local fishermen who knew the waters well tried to use light canoes. They set out to fish deep into the night, hiding in thick fog. Routes were charted through the narrowest channels, inaccessible to Spanish brigantines. Their destination was remote springs on the eastern shore of the large lake. These expeditions represented the highest form of risk. Seized contraband was immediately destroyed, and the boats were sunk. The Conquistadors patrol ships were equipped with powerful lanterns and artillery. They combed the water's surface with methodical precision and incredible persistence. The chances of returning with the precious cargo were virtually nil, but even successful smuggling runs could not change the overall situation. A few dozen jugs of water were a drop in the bucket for the exhausted metropolis. Smuggling only allowed a small circle of people to survive for another day. The global logistics system had collapsed, and it was impossible to make up for it with makeshift methods. The economy of the besieged city had finally regressed to a primitive state. Cut off from the outside world became absolute and hopeless. The defenders could no longer count on even a stroke of luck. The information vacuum compounded the physical isolation, creating a sense of complete detachment. The island's inhabitants did not know what was happening on the mainland, or whether there were any allies there. They were left alone to face their impending catastrophe. The Spanish command did not rush events, conserving their soldiers' strength. They understood that every day worked in their favor toward ultimate victory. Nature and thirst proved to be more reliable allies than cannons and muskets. The siege of Tenochtitlan became a classic example of a war of attrition. Resources prevailed where brute force could not. The slow suffocation of the city was nearing its logical conclusion. The last pockets of resistance were localized in the very center of the capital. Vast areas had already been completely abandoned and left to the enemy. Physical exhaustion had reached the point beyond which the body ceases to function. The great empire was preparing to take its final historical breath. The final weeks of the siege presented a picture of complete systemic collapse. The defenders could no longer hold heavy weapons in their weakened hands. The command structure had collapsed, leaving only scattered groups of survivors. These groups wandered aimlessly among the ruins, trying to find even a drop of water. The city resembled a mirage slowly dissolving in the scorching air. The Spaniards began their final advance toward the central square. They encountered no organized resistance, only rare scattered detachments. The advance was slow, as they had to clear the rubble of destroyed buildings. The Europeans marched through a city that had effectively ceased to exist. It was a territorial conquest, not a battle against a full-fledged army. During this period, the scale of the losses became incalculable. A vast portion of the population simply vanished into oblivion due to a lack of resources. The conquerors found entire neighborhoods where not a single person remained. The effectiveness of the blockade exceeded even the boldest estimates of the Spanish strategists. Logistics inflicted damage incomparable to that of cold weapons or firearms. The last defenders attempted to flee in remote canoes. They hoped to hide in the reeds and escape pursuit. However, vigilant patrols quickly intercepted their light boats. The ruler's capture marked the formal end of this long siege. Deprived of its leader and resources, the resistance ceased instantly and completely. The clamor of battle subsided, replaced by the howling wind in the empty palaces. The waters of Lake Texcoco lapped peacefully against the shores of the now defeated island. A magnificent civilization ceased to exist, leaving behind only myths. The scale of this historical catastrophe is difficult to overestimate or fully comprehend. The era of pre-Columbian America was forever consigned to the past. The siege became a classic example of how infrastructure determines the outcome of a conflict. Whoever controls the water controls the territory and the fate of the people. This principle remained unchanged throughout the centuries that followed. The story of the capital's fall found its way into every textbook on military logistics. It was a triumph of strategy over tactics and brute force. Ashes and dust settled on the stones of the Great Pyramids. A process of coming to terms with what had happened and the redistribution of power on the continent began. The new masters of the land prepared to build their own world on the ruins. The metropolis, which had died of thirst, became the foundation for a new colonial capital. Ahead lay a long era of transformation and radical change. The consequences of Tenochtitlan's fall reshaped the geopolitical map of the entire world. The Spanish Empire gained a foothold for further advancement deep into the continent. The region's colossal resources were now directed toward the needs of the European metropolis. The experience of a successful siege achieved by cutting off logistics was actively applied in other campaigns. The tactic of infrastructure strangulation proved its absolute and unquestionable effectiveness. The ruins of the capital itself underwent a massive reconstruction by the victors. Cathedrals and colonial palaces began to be erected on the sites of the old temples. However, the new authorities took into account the mistakes of their predecessors in the area of supply. The restoration and modernization of the aqueduct became one of the first construction projects. The Spaniards understood that without a reliable water source, the city was unviable. The history of the destruction of the Chapultepec aqueduct has become shrouded in numerous legends. For a long time, it was believed that the city's fall was predetermined by mystical prophecies. Analysis, however, reveals purely pragmatic, logistical reasons for the catastrophe. The gods did not turn their backs on the Aztecs. Rather, the laws of survival for isolated systems turned their backs on them. A study of the sources confirms the methodical, calculated nature of the conquistadors' actions. The mass disappearance of the population altered the demographic situation in the valley. The shortage of labor forced a re-evaluation of approaches to the economy and agriculture. The local landscape began to transform under the influence of European farming methods. Nature took a peculiar revenge for centuries of artificial restraint. The ecosystem of Lake Texcoco began its long and irreversible degradation. The lesson of this siege is relevant for understanding the vulnerability of modern megacities. Any major city today is just as dependent on external supplies of resources. A disruption in the water or electricity supply can paralyze the lives of millions of people. Infrastructure remains the thinnest and weakest link in the security chain. Tenochtitlan became the first historical example of such a large-scale systemic collapse. The strategy of controlling resources continues to shape global politics. Modern conflicts are often fought precisely over access to water or energy resources. Open clashes are giving way to economic and logistical blockades. The methods of the Spanish conquistadors, modernized and refined, are still in use today. Only the scale and speed of such operations have changed. The change of power on the continent triggered a process of deep cultural assimilation. A new mixed society emerged from the ruins of indigenous traditions. But the memory of the great city on the water was passed down from generation to generation. The image of the proud capital, which fell due to thirst, became an important part of the national epic. This story serves as a reminder of the fragility of human achievements. Archaeologists still find the remains of ancient aqueducts beneath the streets of modern Mexico City. These stones bear silent witness to the engineering genius of the past. They remind us of how perfect the system was before its destruction. Researchers continue to marvel at the precision of the pre-Columbian builders' calculations. Their legacy lives on in the foundation of the modern metropolis. Thus ended the epic of one of the most remarkable cities in history. The city fell, a victim of its own unique and unforgiving geography. Logistics delivered its harsh verdict, leaving no room for appeal. This chronicle of the siege is a vivid testament to the ruthlessness of historical processes. The memory of the city that died of thirst is forever etched in the annals of world history. We've seen how logistical vulnerability can destroy an entire civilization faster than any weapon. The history of Tenochtitlan is a stark reminder that control over resources always determines the outcome of a conflict. Let us know in the comments what other historical topics or sieges you'd like to see in our future videos. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new in-depth dives into the mysteries of the past.